The situation in Iran, you mentioned it. Does it have any impact on Russia's economy, on its military capabilities? We already know about the Iranian Shaheeds, that they were officially supplied to Russia. Is it possible that these supplies will stop and so on? Will the situation in Iran affect Russia in any way? I don't know if people will take this as an example, but that's more of a rhetorical question. I even think there's no point in discussing it because, well, I don't know, maybe you have a different opinion.
Well, look, the situation in Iran is fraught with consequences, right?
So,
If the revolution that's practically happening there right now is ultimately successful, I think it will be a tremendous source of joy for humanity. And if a new administration comes to power, it will be very friendly and cooperative to the USA. Well, as you know, Trump just recently received the head of Libya at the White House. So basically, that would be a completely different story. If that happens, Iran will return to the global oil market and to the global gas market, by the way. Let me remind you that Iran is extremely rich not only in oil but also in gas. All of that is currently in poor condition there, quite ruined. And in general, Iran is now experiencing a severe energy crisis, if you look into it. But if this religious regime is overthrown, then a revival could begin there, with help from the Americans and possibly from Israel. And then we would see a rather quick and active return of Iran to the oil market. There will be even more oil supply, even lower prices, and the $69 that the Russian government is so fondly hoping for simply won't exist. The challenge will be to keep it at 50, and that's the 50 that the Americans want and what Trump is talking about. This is the price. WTI crude is American oil. It's a bit cheaper than Brent, but significantly more expensive than Urals. So if it's 50 for WTI, then for Russia it will be at best around 40. And in Russia, the oil production costs are $40 to $47 per barrel. In other words, the Russian oil industry will mostly become unprofitable and will require subsidies from the budget. But subsidies can't be provided because there won't be any income from the oil sector to subsidize the oil sector.
I remember now how we talked about this, and you basically predicted it. But back then, it really seemed unrealistic. I remember that on the broadcasts of Freedom, the Freedom TV channel, for example, we talked about $59 per barrel. Or things like, well, I don't know, that's impossible, blah, blah, blah. Now we're talking about just below $40. And this is reality. So, what I want to say to our viewers right now is, if all of this seems surreal and unreal to you, it's just your impression. Look, it turns out that Russia is surrounded on all sides. Well, in a collapse, the regime falls, and that's Venezuela before Maduro was arrested by China. It's not as interesting anymore. It's like a cow that's already, well, yes, exhausted and doesn't give as much milk as one would like. And Ukraine still refuses to give in. It's sitting there without electricity, heat, or water, and still won't make any concessions, won't give up anything, and keeps fighting. Consequently, it has become increasingly clear that this is already a kind of final death throes, the comprehensive and systematic destruction of Ukraine's vital energy and utility infrastructure. It's like a mean bully who's already throwing whatever stones he has left, just to finish it all off.
Well, I always quote a saying that I think is very true. A father didn't beat his son for playing, but for trying to get even. That's a very accurate saying. That's exactly what Russia is doing, trying to get even. It got itself into a war it simply can't win. This is an incredible problem for them. In fact, they've already been fighting this war longer than the Great Patriotic War lasted. And it's quite amusing how these Russian pro government public pages are now complaining, saying that during the Great Patriotic War, they reached Berlin in 4 years. They took Berlin, but here, after 4 years, they still can't fully capture Kupiansk. So much for Russia's great army. It's funny. It's funny and shameful, but Putin is just trying to get even. But the way he's getting even is truly terrifying. Russia probably doesn't even really understand this. Right now, he's flushing away Russia's entire future. And that means that even if the war ends, Russia will hardly be able to recover in any normal way. It has lost too much. It has squandered too much. It has destroyed too much and created enormous problems. I always say, let's imagine a simple situation. Well, let's say Russia wins the war, let's say along the current front line. It holds on to these territories that it has occupied, but then those territories need to be rebuilt. That will require pouring in an absolutely enormous amount of money. I tried to calculate it, and it turns out you would need to invest 15 to 20 trillion just to make it possible to live there somehow. Russia doesn't have that kind of money at all. So it has saddled itself with a terrible burden, this new one. Meanwhile, the old territory of Russia is even more devastated, and no one knows what to do about it. And Russia is slashing social programs on the fly. Recently, a deputy named Gurulyov made a statement. He exists, yes, an outstanding political figure in Russia, and he said, "Guys, we promised you a program to relocate people from unsafe housing. Forget it, there's no money, all the money is going to the war. Just live and pray that your house doesn't collapse on you. If you pray, you'll be fine and the house won't fall down. When the war is over, maybe we'll relocate you. So keep living in these old houses that are suspiciously creaking above your heads, and to keep them from collapsing, pray harder day and night. Maybe then you'll survive." So that's exactly it. Utilities aren't being repaired, emergency housing isn't being relocated, and they're starting to cut funding for roads, which means soon you won't even be able to travel properly across Russia. As Putin said, why do you need cars? You don't have any roads. Well, he was right about that.
At least he told some truth.
Yeah, so that's the picture. In other words, Russia is actually destroying its own future, and in that future, there's only despair and poverty for Russia. Especially since, I repeat, Russia's main breadwinner, the oil industry, is in trouble, and it's not going to recover. Let me explain why. Russia potentially has a lot of oil and gas, but that's only potential. So it's like the wealth is in the ground. But they're located in places where extraction is extremely expensive. If you're extracting gas, say somewhere around the Yamal Peninsula, you still have to somehow transport it somewhere afterwards. As long as there were pipelines, there was at least some kind of idea. You pumped it into the pipeline and it went on to Europe. And now, when all of that isn't working, the question arises, well, let's say I build an LNG plant on Yamal, but how am I going to transport the LNG from there? There were some absolutely fantastic projects. People in Russia have an astonishing imagination, especially when there's hope of siphoning off budget money. They come up with such projects. There was this marvelous tallow project. You're going to get a kick out of this. The idea was to organize the production of nuclear submarines to transport liquefied gas under the ice of the Northern Sea route. And what a beautiful budget that would be. Yeah, it's quite a marvel, but what can you do? So that's why in Russia, unfortunately, there is very little left for Russians themselves. There's hardly any oil left. There's a lot of gas, but as for the gas, no one wants to take it. So what do you do with it? As you can see, even China is not agreeing to a second pipeline. They can't manage to persuade them about Power of Siberia 2. And as for oil, according to estimates, at today's price levels, there's enough for about 28 years. Oil for,
Wait, did you say 28 years?
yes,
How many years until 2042?
17. 17. Yes. So basically, to put it simply, the situation is this. The current generation of Russians might end up living in a country that can't export oil. It won't have any oil left for export. Maybe they'll still extract some for their own needs, but overall, there won't be anything left for export. You see, I'm talking about things that people find unbelievable, but economics is a harsh thing. It's a tough business. If you're extracting oil at a loss, then why are you doing it? Or is someone supposed to cover your losses? But it's just not realistic to compensate for the losses of the oil industry. Although that's already starting to happen, just pay attention. I never make things up. I get that people think I'm inventing some kind of horror stories. But notice that about a month and a half ago, I think Putin signed a special decree granting tax breaks, if I'm not mistaken, until May of next year for Rosneft and Gazprom. In other words, the companies that are supposed to be feeding the budget with money are being given tax breaks so they pay less, because otherwise they would collapse and stop operating. These are Rosneft and Gazprom, the two largest state-owned companies in Russia, the two main breadwinners. Gazprom, once Russia's national treasure. Let me remind you, what is its current state? A loss-making company. Rosneft is in a very bad financial situation. To keep them from dying, they are given subsidies and tax breaks. So where will the money come from then? Well, they've raised VAT, they'll take it from the population, but